Good evening, and welcome to tonight's lecture, The Conscience of a Conservative, Returning to Civil Discourse in American Politics. My name is Ryan Brown, and I'm a sophomore majoring in history and the president of Vanderbilt's College Republicans.
Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Sean Swinford, and I'm a junior majoring in economics and political science, and I also serve as the Speaker of the Senate for the Vanderbilt Student Government. Ryan and I are here to introduce our distinguished speakers who will offer unique reflections about the current state of politics and lawmaking in America. Facilitating our discussion this evening is Chancellor Nicholas Zeppos. Chancellor Zeppos is the university's 8th chancellor, a position he has held since 2008. He is a highly respected professor and legal scholar that began his time at Vanderbilt in 1987 as an assistant professor in the law school. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Zeppos to the stage.
Thank you.
Also joining us this evening is distinguished visiting Professor Jon Meacham, who holds the Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Chair. Mr. Meacham is a renowned presidential historian and Pulitzer Prize-winning author. His newest book, The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels, became the New York Times #1 bestseller upon its release last May. Please join me in welcoming Jon Meacham to the stage.
Glad you.
Our next panelist is This American Life producer, Zoe Chase. Ms. Chase started her career in radio journalism when she became an intern for National Public Radio's Weekend Edition in 2008. Since then, she has produced countless stories for NPR programs like Morning Edition and Planet Money. She joined the team at This American Life in 2015 and has since spent much of her time covering conservatism in America. Chase shadowed Senator Jeff Flake closely in 2017 and 2018, as he played a pivotal role in the last 2 sessions of Congress. Please join me in welcoming Zoe Chase to the stage.
The final member of tonight's panel is former Senator Jeff Flake. Senator Flake is a 5th-generation Arizonan raised on a cattle ranch in the town of Snowflake, which was founded in 1878 by Erastus Snow and William Jordan Flake, Senator Flake's great-great-grandfather. After serving in the United States House of Representatives from 2001 to 2013, Flake was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he sat on the Judiciary Committee, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and the Foreign Relations Committee. He is known for his principled stands on spending and free trade, and his negotiations and bipartisanship on complicated issues such as immigration. Often at odds with the administration of President Donald Trump, Senator Flake published Conscience of a Conservative, a rejection of destructive politics and a return to principle in August 2017 to argue for a return to traditional conservatism and civility in our national dialogue. Senator Flake chose not to run for re-election in 2018, but continues to advocate for these ideals in American politics today. Please join me in welcoming Senator Jeff Flake to the stage.
All right.
Well, Senator, it's such a privilege to have you here, and thank you so much for spending this time with us, but also the time you spent on the campus today and interacting with our students. Zoe, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
And John, thanks for letting us use your living room furniture.
You're welcome.
For for the event.
I just said to Zoe, this is like the Tonight Show. You're too young for that. She said, I'll Google it later. So,
So let me just start this out with the book and your principles, and what are the core principles of American conservatism, and how are they faring, and what's their future?
Well, conservatism to me has always been rooted in respect for limited government, economic freedom, individual responsibility, free trade, and strong American leadership. And that's kind of defined and animated the party for generations. And back when Barry Goldwater wrote the original Conscience of a Conservative, he and William F. Buckley were concerned at that time about this kind of growing fervor among the John Birch Society at that time. And they said that that would represent, and they were kind of given to conspiracy theories. Eisenhower was a closet communist, the Birchers thought. And Goldwater and Buckley thought that that is what they called an emblem of irresponsibility in the party, and that the party needed to stay focused on traditional conservatism. And they very much marginalized that movement. And that there was nobody to do that this time, I think. And I'm fearful that we're departing as Republicans, as a Republican, from that traditional conservatism.
Do you have a lot of, I guess, former colleagues now who pat you on the back and said, God, that was really great, I agree with you, but won't go on the floor or TV and say, you're right?
They won't do it with a mic like this. But yeah, there are, I think most of my colleagues are more inclined to support and have always advocated for traditional conservatism, and some are uncomfortable at the direction that the party is headed. But right now, that is the soul of the party, at least those who vote in Republican primaries. And that's a difficult fact to escape. And so it's a difficult thing to come out and say that the party is veered from its roots. But I think we need to.
Senator, to carry your analogy forward, when Buckley and Goldwater were reading the Birchers out in 64, 65, they were in fact able to read them out. Yeah. And even then it was an element, not the predominant force. As recently as your colleague Senator McCain, as recently as now Senator Romney, the party was able to maintain a certain kind of center of gravity. You could disagree, but ultimately they fit within a river that Reagan and the Bushes had helped define. As you look back on it, was there a moment, was there an issue, was there a battle that signaled the fact that the Titanic was going to steam out of Southampton? You can not accept the image if you like, but.
Well, let me say, I think that the roots came much before. When I got to Congress in 2001, I'd run a think tank for almost a decade in Arizona, the Goldwater Institute. And I still keep a T-shirt, just as a reminder, it was Dick Armey and Billy Tozan, a Republican and a Democrat. And they went around the country, mostly to college campuses, to talk about the merits of the flat tax versus the sales tax, flat tax versus consumption tax. And they had like concert dates printed on the back of the shirt, and they packed halls. And that was, the real driving policy debates in the party. And not long after I got to D.C., I realized those policy debates were kind of going. And if the Republicans couldn't be the party of fiscal conservatism, then we had to argue on other things, the culture wars, flag burning, Terry Schiavo. And so I think the party started to drift from its roots then. But when I really realized things were going was, with free trade, one, strong element, the Republican Party, where you had, not just among Republicans, but among Democrats, the four leading contenders in the presidential election in 2016. All of them came out in opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership and that direction. And I thought, we're in a different world now. And so I don't know if there's any one point, but there were steps along the way where I thought politics is changing drastically.
Can I just ask, though, actually, because we haven't had a chance to get this philosophical, so we might as well do it now. You know, thinking about Goldwater, and I read your book and sort of the roots of conservatism, I have wondered, like, because Goldwater was against the Civil Rights Act, which is something that you talk about in your book, it is this thing where I wonder how an ideology could make that big of a sort of historical mistake and yet still be a good guide later on. Because I do think that some of those roots maybe lead to some people feeling less welcome within conservatism, like non-white people, basically. And so, no. I'm a reporter. I'm just asking, you know, I'm a historian. I'm just thinking these things through. And I know that the senator has thought about this. So how have you kind of squared that in terms of, you know, people feeling included or excluded from conservatism?
Well, I mentioned that in the book, that's one thing Goldwater did oppose. And the one thing I disagreed with Goldwater on. Having said that, Goldwater was outnumbered in the party for those who did support it. And it was a lot of Democrats as well who opposed the Civil Rights Act. So it wasn't necessarily the party position to oppose the Civil Rights Act. It was a position that Goldwater had that I think, you know, in the end, he always explained it as a constitutional issue, but they moved away from that. So I like I said, it's one area I disagreed with Goldwater on, but that wasn't the party position at that time.
Right, it wasn't the Republican Party position. Right. But just in terms of conservatism, it may have cast a long shadow in terms of the history of the ideology is all.
Well, I think we're seeing, you know, some of it with the Steve King blow up in the last couple of weeks. And that is one area where I think the party needs to be certainly a lot more diligent in you know, eschewing that element, if you will, that emblem of irresponsibility or racism. I certainly had hoped that we would find a primary challenger for Steve King, but barring that, I openly cheered for his Democratic opponent. And I think Republicans need to be much more willing to do that, to say, yeah, we would like to have somebody else in a primary who could do better, but if they don't, let's support the opponent. And we had that in the 1990s when David Duke became was it the senatorial candidate, the nominee?
Gubernatorial in Louisiana.
You had Republicans from Washington, some of our party leaders, traveling to Louisiana to campaign against him. And I think that we need to be more diligent and do more of that, I think, as a party if we're going to survive.
To what extent is there a party at this point? I'm not saying that to be clever. I'm really not. I'm not saying it to be clever, but it's become this wholly owned. The mechanics of it are now a wholly owned subsidiary of the president. My overly facile joke has been that this is the only Trump and the Republican Party is the only recorded case of a hijacker boarding a plane and the passenger side with the hijacker, right? And so, who is it? You tried. You stood up. You know, you tried the Daniel Webster hat. And now you're talking to us. So, you know. So
Speak for yourself.
Let that be a lesson to you.
Speak for yourself.
This is right where you want it to be.
So I'm serious. Is there, when you say the party, to what extent can you draw a bright line now between people who support the president on a kind of cult of personality with some ideological agreement, and to what extent is there an institution that is separate from this particular president's mayhem and energy driven by that?
Well, that's a good question. Candidates running for the Senate or the House will always poll and ask kind of a tracker question that they want to see how it plays over time. What is the most important issue to you? And almost always it's jobs or the economy, or if jobs and the economy are doing well, then maybe it's immigration or some other thing that's not at the top otherwise. Now, and I found asking that question in my race, the most important question among Republican primary voters, and that's all you care about when you're running in the primary, the most important issue is, are you with the president?
Yeah.
That's what they wanted to know.
That's the
And it certainly played out in Arizona in this case, and the one who ran for the seat that I held, the Republican and the Democrat ended up winning, although the state still has 200,000 more registered Republicans. But basically, from all the statewide Republican offices, those who embraced the president, who stood on the campaign stage with him when he came to town, they lost. Those who kept a distance and were more traditional conservatives, Republicans, won. And I do think that cult of personality, and I wrote about it right after the midterms, I think Republicans need to be a lot more attuned to the drubbing that we took in the midterms.
Yeah.
The Senate, it was very difficult to lose the Senate, but to lose 40 seats in the House and to have exit polling show that over a 4-year period, Republicans where we had a 12-point advantage in 2014 among independents, that's now a 12-point disadvantage, a 24-point swing in just 4 years. Among women voters, a 4-point disadvantage in 2014 is now a 19-point disadvantage. You just cannot win statewide elections or in most districts with that kind of swing. And so to the extent that the party is a manifestation of the person in office, then it's going to be a rough road ahead.
Yeah.
Let me ask this question. Why do you think he won? I mean, he didn't win the popular vote, and I love colleges and universities. I'm not a big fan of the Electoral College, but John wrote that for me, by the way. So,
They're not the SEC anymore.
Yeah. Why do you think he won? And I've had a lot of really smart people talk to me about this, but what's your analysis of the election? As close as it was, and you can say, well, midterms are kind of the payback, and every president gets it too. Why did he win?
Well, obviously there was dissatisfaction about where we were. I think he had a particularly weak opponent on the Democratic side. I think any Republican, other than, well, I won't name names, but I think virtually any one of the 17 that he vanquished would have won that race. That's my belief. So weak opposition on the other side, but you can, and he managed to really motivate people, certainly, to get out and vote. And I liken it to 1994 in California, Pete Wilson running for a second term. They wanted something to get the base riled up, and it was Prop 187 to deny benefits to illegal aliens. And it worked. It riled up the base. They turned out a lot of numbers. He won re-election.
Even though it's like unconstitutional, most of that.
Yeah, and
right?
a lot of
Like
it,
didn't matter.
didn't
That's
matter.
The way they were
Speed bump.
advertising it.
It was, but what that meant, though, is with the exception of Arnold Schwarzenegger, different kind of Republican and then independent, not one Republican has been elected to statewide office in Arizona or in California, and will likely not be for another generation. So you can whip up the base into a frenzy and to really motivate people to come out. But if you move beyond and simply drill down on that base and expect to go further, I just don't think the numbers are there. The Trump base, for lack of a better term, is very real, and it is very solid right now. But politically, it's just not large enough to carry ahead. And I say that's a good thing, but I just don't think it is large enough.
Do you think that part of the reason he won, and you kind of see it, is he would not go through some states and talk about cutting Medicare and he did not run on a balanced budget. And so when you look at some of the states, and as close as they were, was that key to his strategy? And is that now part of the party as well, which is, it doesn't win to talk about Social Security or Medicare, and that's how we won.
I think that certainly helped him. Those aren't things you want to go out and campaign on.
Yeah.
Now,
But Republicans
yeah, and
have.
some have felt,
I
you know,
mean, Mitt
held in-
Romney went to Michigan and said, I'm against the auto bailout.
Right.
Well, that's brave and
It
destined to
is.
fail.
I'm not saying it's not the right thing.
No, I'm not either.
It's just politically sometimes not a wise
Yeah.
thing to do. And so I do think that certainly didn't hurt him not to talk about those things. The problem is now you have nobody talking about it in Washington.
Right.
Nobody. And it's going to be that much more difficult to solve the problem that we have.
Was there ever discussion, and I'm not advocating this, but when we're getting such, we've got 51, we can get stuff through, why didn't the Republicans take up entitlement reform then? And why did the majority leader not take that up? And because that seemed to me, that's the time, it's like, all right, we're gonna cut taxes and we're gonna fix entitlements, and, you know, it's not like the party or either party was sitting around saying, but we don't wanna do that to the minority. Why wasn't that done at that time?
Your
I
friend
think-
Mitch McConnell.
What?
Explain how he works.
I would go all the way back to George W. Bush talked about doing that. 2002, 2004, it was cast as privatization of Social Security, and that became a dead letter. Obviously, President Trump saw that history, lived through that.
Even some managing of some of the drivers.
But 51 votes isn't control. You really need 60 in the Senate to move something like that, and you have to have presidential leadership.
Well,
Even if our leadership in Congress was inclined to move forward, and Paul Ryan certainly was.
Right.
Unless you have presidential
No,
leadership.
I know the
on
president was not going to do that. But it's interesting to me that to me is also a critical point for the conscience of the party, which is, okay, this is our time.
You bet.
And
The problem, I think, on that issue is we have skated along with seemingly no penalties. You know, we've passed the threshold that most countries get to in terms of debt to GDP ratios, where, you know, you become like Japan and just can't grow economically, and you have to impose austerity measures. We're still the best house in a bad global neighborhood.
Right.
And as long as we are, we can skate by and with no consequences yet. And so the longer you go, the more difficult it is for members of Congress to come out and say, hey, we've got to, you know, right-size our entitlement programs and make them sustainable. It's just, it's you know, tough medicine nobody wants to take right now.
well, what about even the shutdown, and then we have a debt ceiling coming? Do you think we're in danger of just, okay, well, everyone's coming to work, they'll get paid later. And we're not gonna pay our debts, you'll get paid later. That we're in a really totally new normal about what is kind of acceptable for the running of the government. And the arguments over entitlements and tax reform and the parties, I mean, we can say, well, that's in a framework. But now we have a totally different way of doing business where, well, you know, call those people in for 3 days and have them process farm applications. And, oh, the debt ceiling, you know, tell them to roll the loan. What, are we losing really control even of our governance?
Well, as much as it'd be easy to blame the president for this kind of thing, we've been laying this groundwork for a while. Congress
We've been like running for a marathon. We kind of, this is our pattern over the last 20 years. Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
You mentioned President Bush. You served under 3 presidents, Bush, President Obama, and the incumbent. Can you compare and, he is, I mean, come on. It's not like Voldemort, you know. Compare and contrast those 3 presidents' virtues and vices.
President Bush, when I came in with him, in the House when he took the presidency. And as a fiscal conservatism, I kind of cringed. And a conservative, I cringed at No Child Left Behind. I thought that was an intrusion into local education policy. And then prescription drug benefit came along, and Mike Pence and I kind of led the charge against that. We failed, but just barely. And then I had running battles with President Bush on Cuba. I wanted to lift the embargo, in particular the travel ban. I was able to lead an effort in the House, and we had the same effort in the Senate to pass legislation to really defund the travel ban at least, and I couldn't get President Bush to sign it. I had endless arguments with the president and Karl Rove on this issue. But I point that out, say that, but I agreed with President Bush on immigration and a number of issues. And we worked well together. And I traveled with him to Arizona and elsewhere. And then when he left office, he came and did fundraisers for me, a guy who he disagreed with on some pretty significant issues. That couldn't happen today. And similar degree with President Obama. He was not nearly as prone to, he'd spent less time, not much time on Capitol Hill, didn't have long-term friendships there. To some people, he was seen as cold and kind of cerebral, but still, I went and played basketball with him, on the South Lawn, a bunch of Republicans and Democrats, and we disagreed on some issues, but I worked with him on the Cuba issue, for example. And the contrast is with a Republican and a Democrat, you had people who really understood that the people on the other side of the aisle are our opponents, but they're not our enemies. And you're going to need them later on for something else. And the notion that anyone would call them on Twitter or on television losers or clowns was just foreign. And so that's a pretty big contrast right there.
Yeah. Was there ever a moment where you thought Trump would conventionalize himself? That after winning, he would settle down, the shtick would go down a few notches?
There was a bit of a hope when he gave his victory speech that night. If you remember, it was gracious and I thought presidential. And I certainly had my differences during the campaign with him, but I thought and hoped that he'd flip the switch. But it wasn't very long thereafter that it became apparent that he was right back on Twitter and the same grudges and everything else. So it didn't last long.
Zoe?
Oh, did I?
Zoe,
I was just thinking about
what.
Sorry, go ahead.
You're such a thoughtful, reflective person. You want to hear both sides of the question, civil debate, but yet you've become a politician in a time of Twitter and news, instant news. I'm curious, and then you started having Zoe working with you. How have you, is it generally more information is good information, or, Twitter and things like that, it was a better world without them? And I'd be curious what Zoe thinks about that as well.
Why Senator Flake worked with me?
No.
Is the wait, don't tell me thing.
Yeah.
He was on wait, don't tell me.
The way news is done, but the instantaneous nature of things and the effect on politicians.
Go ahead, Senator. Yeah.
It's changed politics drastically. I remember running the first time and worrying more than anything about, as far as the media was concerned, whether the Arizona Republic was going to endorse me. Or you ran out to the curb to pick up the paper to see, if a story ran or they reported on an event that you'd had. Now, an influential blog or something else is more important than an editorial from a paper, or it just changed completely. And one thing that it and the current politics have done is kind of take the nuance out of politics completely. If you're somebody in the position I had until 2 weeks ago, the incentives now, all of the incentives say, don't deliberate, don't show any sign that you might be open to change your mind, or this hearing that you're about to hold might inform your opinion, or that an investigation that might be happening might influence you. Because I can tell you, people in my former position will make a calculation that says, I only want to anger one side. And if I make the decision quickly enough, they will never think I was in play anyway, so I won't make them as mad. But if you show any sign, whether it's any big issue that you deal with on debt and deficit, on climate change, on Kavanaugh, on you name it, if you show any sign that you might be gettable or might change your mind or deliberate, then you get it from all sides. And not just little stuff on us. Everything from just being blasted on Twitter or in the blogs to death threats, all of it. And so it really, all the incentives push people to the extreme and drive people into the camps that they don't want to emerge from. Because then at worst, you just anger one side.
Yeah, I mean, I almost have too many thoughts about this because on the one hand, and I remember Senator Flake talking a lot of times about shirts versus skins on Capitol Hill, just the feeling that it was always two teams. It didn't really matter what the issue was. It was just kind of fealty to your team. But I don't know, recently I've been reading about Newt Gingrich, who also Senator Flake wrote about in his book, and thinking about, he actually played a big role at one point in sort of nationalizing politics. Like before in the 60s and 70s and stuff, people would split the ticket more often, that you would vote for maybe your Democratic congressman, but you vote Republican for president, like Nixon or whatever, because the Democratic candidate was like so wild and out there, George McGovern, whatever. And so Gingrich was like, I want people to see Democrat and think George McGovern. I don't want them to think about their congressman. I want them to see the sort of most extreme, radical, communist, lefty, that they can see. And he really worked, as he made his way through Congress, he really worked on his party being able to speak that way. Now, it's not just the Republicans, right? Like also the Democrats, when Robert Bork came up, and that's a famous moment of just kind of like all the Democrats getting on one team and being pretty vicious. So I've been thinking about like what separates the way that the politics, I do feel like, has been a team sport for kind of a while. But the thing about like this moment that I think is different, first of all, it's the social media situation. And then there's just like a shorthand. Like I do think that you can say something like, and I think this is really, really true. I see it on the left a lot, that if you say, I don't know if you said something along the lines of, maybe there should be respect for the kind of presumption of innocence with the Kavanaugh thing. Like, you could see a Democrat having that thought, but everything gets summed up so quickly. Like, you would really be, I think, pushed aside in any kind of national setting if you said something like that or out loud. And so it's not that I think that it's necessarily more team sports, but it's so much faster. And instead of having a president who attempts to sort of unify things, instead it's like he loves that. That's like real, and it is fun to watch. It's fun to watch these two sides like go at it. I mean, I spent a lot of time today watching this bus travel around the Capitol that was filled with Congress people who thought they were going to leave and go on this congressional delegation trip to Afghanistan. Trump canceled at the last second. So there's reporters like running after a bus. And they're like, there's shadowy figures on the bus. I think Adam Schiff is in there. It's like, it's wild. Like, it's wild.
Like a white Bronco leading it.
Yeah, I know. Like, and it was doing these circles around the Capitol building.
Oh my God.
Like, because they didn't know if they were supposed to
And I'm
leave
missing this.
I know.
Oh. Yeah.
I know. That's what we both could have been there. So there's something that's super fun to watch about that. So anyway, that's a long answer to that question.
Boy, oh boy, though.
That's why we had professional wrestling.
Well, I was going to say, but you're right. I mean, but that's what this particular president
Hall of Fame.
set out to do. Yeah, he's
Yeah,
in the Hall of Fame of the professional wrestling. I mean, this is the only Hall of Fame he's going to be in.
Yeah.
But he wanted to, he said, it was in the Times, he said during the transition, I want to treat the presidency as a TV show in which I vanquish my rivals every day. And you just described it. He vanquished Pelosi. He's going to pay for it. I wouldn't piss her off. Man, she's got, you know, that. So well, I guess the question from '01, did it really feel as if you were walking around at the Constitutional Convention when you showed up in '01 to when you left? How different did it feel to go to work every day from '01 to 18?
No, it's well, yeah, I mentioned that I came in with Mike Pence.
Yeah.
He was running the think tank in Indiana. I was running one in Arizona. He commented one time as we were sitting there, and we thought that politics had been degraded, you know, at that point, discussing, you know, federalizing education policy. And he said one time, he said, I feel like that you and me, we're Minutemen. We were called up to the battlefront in the Revolutionary War, and as soon as we got here, we were told the war is over. And the battle of ideas at that time. But when I compare that to now, oh my goodness, then it was the Constitutional Convention. So when we were debating substantive things, I remember, speaking of Dick Armey, I remember going to his office, and this was before 9/11. We were running surpluses, at least nominal surpluses at that time, and we were discussing how we could pay down the national debt more quickly than the financial instruments that we had engaged in, some of the debt instruments, would allow us to. And I mean, these are really substantive kind of debates that today, it's all just political, one-upsmanship. How will this play? How do we get an advantage for the next election? Or to get this short-term policy objective. So we're not in a good place right now.
No. I guess one of the overarching questions of the hour is, and Aaron Burr once said that if a demagogue is ever to be stopped, ultimately it will happen on the floor of the United States Senate. Given the Russia investigation, given what we know and what we don't know, I think conventional wisdom has it that it would not be terribly difficult to impeach the president in the House, but it would be incredibly difficult to convict and remove in the Senate. From what you know now, what's in the public record about a relationship with Russia and any other related campaign issues, where do you think that's going?
Oh, Bob Mueller is a professional, and obviously that investigation has been done like he does everything. Very careful, no leaks, very well done. I have a hard time believing that he'll come back with enough that will, on its face, turn enough of the party, to say, hey, we can't move forward with this man. I'm talking about the leaders on Capitol Hill, or to lead to impeachment. And my personal preference, I make no bones about it, I didn't support the president. I won't support him in the future, but I would hate to see him impeached. I just would hate to see, I've been in and lived in and been in too many countries where the cycle you get into is not to say, we're going to win the next election. We didn't do well enough this time, but we're going to contest the next one better. But we're just going to try to disqualify our opponents.
May I interrupt, sir?
Yes.
Hypothetically, though, if evidence emerged.
Oh, you bet. Yes, then.
So,
but how likely
you know now it does not rise to impeachable level?
Right.
Right?
It does not. What we know now, and I can't claim to know more than is out there publicly. And I obviously hope that there's not there. I hope that we have a vigorous debate. I'm on record as saying that I hope somebody else runs in the Republican primary. But I hope that we don't put the country through an impeachment process just because of what it does in terms of an already very polarized public, that we get into a longer cycle of that.
Is it possible, do you believe that the President of the United States is a witting or unwitting asset of the Russian government?
I don't know. I'll wait for that. I'll give a very politician answer, even though I'm not. We'll have to wait for the. I have a hard time believing, after watching that campaign up close, that the president himself or others were in a position to do much in that regard. Unwitting, perhaps, but certainly some. I have a hard time believing that, but I'm waiting for the Mueller report.
What about, we started talking about the kind of bedrock principles of conservatism, and certainly tradition and values very much enter into that discussion. So even if things aren't, say, impeachable, or what are the values at stake in the situation that the country faces itself with foreign, evidence of foreign interference in elections? Frankly, I've always, not that anyone would listen to me, but I've always thought that making it easier to vote would help the country. And so what are the real values that are associated with conservatism at this point in America that don't necessarily say balanced budget, kind of freedom, less government intrusion? What are the core values that are at stake, such as virtue and integrity and honesty? Are those at play, or am I just too naive and it's politics, and so none of that applies?
Well, I would hope that the Republican Party would say we stand for those values, but I would also hope the Republican Party wouldn't say that we have a corner on those values. Mm-hmm. But I do think we've entered a period where I gave a speech on this, where truth is pretty relative, and I never thought the fact checkers at the Post and elsewhere would have to be so busy on so many things, that it just, people just kind of discount that when they hear the president speaking or members of Congress, that there has to be some expectation of truth, that we have some shared facts, and that's what we seem to have moved away from. But I can't claim that that's something that the Republican Party has a corner on, or should claim to have a corner on.
Hey, hang on. We'll take some questions later. So, yes, thank you. Okay. So,
No, I had a question also for you.
All right. Zoe.
Which was, I don't know, like just thinking about because when we talked about, we talked a little bit earlier before we all got here, and you were talking about thinking about 2001 to 2018 and just contrasting and comparing that political life under those presidents. But just for you going through this, I wondered if you kind of stand by all the same stuff because of what you've been through. Like, it seems like sort of out from under you was pulled your constituency, even your party, what the party stood for was kind of pulled out from under you. And I wondered if it made you think, like, I don't know, maybe being a committed supply sider, it's not very popular, and maybe I was wrong about that. Or even my demeanor, which is kind of polite and sort of formal, almost austere in some ways. It's not keeping up with the, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's and the way that Trump has made himself really, like during the campaign anyway, like a lot of fun to listen to in ways that that politicians usually
Not,
aren't.
not fun at all to listen to. You say.
Well, I
We
worked on that. I
We think you're a
worked on
barrel of
that.
laughs.
I don't find it austere at all, so.
But I just, you
No, I
know,
know
like
what you
in terms of both your sort of your bearing as a politician and the principles that you were advocating all those years, did you rethink anything?
No, I'm still a committed conservative. Conservative that believes in limited government and economic freedom and free trade and strong American leadership. I think that those are values that have animated, like I said, the party for generations and need to if we're going to remain a viable party and force. As far as my own demeanor, it's all I know. And, and you know, it's interesting. I've been not unsparing in terms of my criticism of the president for his language and crudeness. But then we had the new Democrat who was elected who used a very crude term to say that we need to impeach the president. And I thought out of fairness, I would point out that that's not language that should be used. And because the president often speaks this way is no excuse. There were 30,000, not likes, comments.
I was going to say, I'm sure you got a great response to that.
Comments from people on the left saying, no, we need to match fire with fire. If the president speaks like this is how we have to speak. That was, not everybody said that, but that was the overwhelming sentiment. And I mean, you can't go this way. You can't give in to that. Or who are we? Where are we? And whether it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party who stands up and says, I'm going to be better than that, that's a party that has a better future, I hope, because I can't imagine politics being more crude or vulgar than it often is these days.
You earlier rattled off some compelling statistics about the preference of women voters and other voting groups in the party. And then we had the Kavanaugh nomination and the Me Too movement.
Right.
So how does the party really address the question of gender and what has been, if any, the impact of the Me Too movement on the politics and the institution that you observed, Congress?
Well, I mean, the Me Too movement has claimed a lot of victims in Congress, but on both sides of the aisle, in terms of retirements or people forced out of office. I think that the trouble that our party is in more than anything is not, bringing up Kavanaugh, for example. You can argue, as I do, that there ought to be some kind of standard in terms of presumption of innocence, and that we can't have a system where an allegation uncorroborated in itself can disqualify somebody. You can take that position without saying that the women, for example, in the elevator with me, you remember that.
I was there with.
Without claiming, like the president did, that they were paid advocates and they, and ridiculing them or demeaning them, or to say that Dr. Ford, to ridicule her or her statements. That drives women away. I think women have been walking away from the party for a while. I think now they're in a dead sprint. If you look, if you look at the latest statistics, as I mentioned, with women, we had a 4% deficit, is now a 19% deficit, just in the space of 4 years. Among rural women, Republicans had a 21-point surplus in 2014. That's now just a 4-point surplus among rural women. So we're not long for the earth as a viable party if we continue down this road. And a lot of it is the style and tenor and tone of the debate and how we deal with this.
Well, I've got some questions from the audience, and I'm going to take a few of these, and Zoe and John, feel free to jump in. This, of course, is a simple yes, no. Will you vote for Trump in 2020?
No.
Okay, well. I thought this was an interesting one. What advice would you give Mitt Romney now? Or what advice did you give Romney, since I'm sure you're pretty close to him?
I liked his op-ed,
Yeah.
and I told him so. I do think that Mitt is not in Washington just to mark time. I think that he made that pretty clear, when he wrote that op-ed. And I hope that he continues to speak out about where the party ought to be, what the soul of the party really is or should be. I think that that's valuable. He's in for a 6-year term. That will outlast the presidency.
I think one of the most interesting things is your perspective and policies, and one of the questions, and I'm very curious about, the influence of your missionary work and your international work on your work on immigration and just policy in general.
Sure, I served in South Africa and Zimbabwe as a Mormon missionary back in the early 1980s, and then later Cheryl, my wife, who's here in the audience, and I moved to the country of Namibia, and I ran a political foundation the year that Namibia gained its independence from South Africa. And all of that had just a tremendous influence. That was at the time, this was 1989-90, when the Berlin Wall came down. Namibia had its elections the same week the Berlin Wall came down, and so the whole world was looking at the United States. We were the only viable model out there. There was the book written, The End of History. And this is, the competing ideologies that capitalism had won. And it didn't turn out to be that simple, but it really did influence. And what I saw out there when I've lived overseas and what I've seen traveling a lot as well is, the influence for good that the United States has had. And I remember clearly in Namibia during that time, just reading the Time magazine account of Václav Havel, the president of then Czechoslovakia, who just months before was imprisoned by his leaders, and was now the president of Czechoslovakia. And he gave a speech before a joint session of Congress, which was just a love letter to the United States, thanking us for liberating, his country and others, and for always being there as the standard. And it just, it struck me like nothing ever has. And it was really kind of a turning point in my thinking about what I would do in the future, that the United States can be, by virtue of influence and example, not just military might or foreign aid, but an example to the world. And so it had a big influence. And also on the immigration issue, I grew up on a ranch and a farm. We employed a lot of migrant labor that came up from the South. This was the 70s and the 80s. It wasn't illegal to hire them, I should point out. At that time, it was illegal for them to be there. But I saw how hard they worked, and I saw their motivation. And I could never, after that time, look at them and see a criminal class. And that's why, I've worked on immigration reform, comprehensive reform, a way to deal in a rational way with those who are here illegally and set up a structure where people can come and work and return home. And that's why some of the president's tone and rhetoric, about Mexican rapists coming across the border, or a judge who couldn't judge fairly because of his Mexican heritage, why that just hit so hard. And then the Muslim ban and things like that, being Mormon or a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who, we had some persecution that way that we've experienced over the years, and to single out and apply a religious test to any group, Muslim, Christian, or Jew, is just foreign and alien to the United States. And so that, as far as my upbringing.
Thank you. I've asked some questions from the audience, but John, I want to let you have the last question, and turn it back to you.
On your hope and fear gauge for the future, where stands the needle on this winter night?
On this, I'm sorry?
But the future of the country, where do you stand?
Oh, it's I'm more concerned than I was a few years ago. I mean, the hope that I have is, you know, the week that I was elected to the Senate, we came back and they took us to the National Archives, just at a dinner, Republicans and Democrats, those of us who were elected. And I just remember this so clearly. They took us up to the legislative vault, they call it, where we got to see and hold some of the meaningful documents that document our history, you know, oaths of allegiance signed by people, witnessed by General Washington, and things related to, you know, to the Civil War and women's suffrage. And, you know, the feeling I had coming out of that is that we have faced some pretty tough challenges over the years. But this system has withstood them all, that the pendulum swings, sometimes with a vengeance. And we see that in certain elections, and we've seen that. And that still gives me hope that these big challenges that we face on the fiscal side, they are daunting. When you look at our debt to GDP and where we are and how we're going to have to right that ship given demographics, that's going to take some real tough leadership and tough medicine. And, you know, the rogue states and terrorist activity overseas and the emerging, you know, the Russian bear coming back in China and its movement. There's a lot out there to worry about, but we have a good system that tends to withstand the foibles of those who go through it, all of us, including yours truly. And so that still gives me hope, but I can tell you the challenges are steep. And when I look at the next 2 years, I do hope that we become ourselves again. And John, you wrote about this in The Soul of America. That's something I quote often, that we have been through this before. And or things like this before. You put it much more eloquently.
No, that's about what I said. Yeah.
And we
Sold quite well.
and I've mentioned in speeches I've given, but that was before Twitter and nuclear weapons.
True.
And but still, this is a good system, and frankly, there are a lot of good people in government. One thing that you know, our institutions of government have been tested severely, and some I'm still concerned about, but some have held. The judiciary and the press and others, these institutions have taken a beating and a battering and a lot of ridicule and are holding. And I think that they still will.
Well, we're kind of here in what I call the optimism business. Every year, we bring in new students, we cure diseases, and it's very hard for me to look at our students and say, and our faculty and staff, you can't solve these problems. Do you encourage people to go into public life, though? When you talk to all of our talented students, and
you
say bye or caveat emptor.
No, I did today. You could ask them. We need good people in office.
That's great.
And what the piece of advice that I often give is, for those, you know, growing up, when I was trying to decide to enter politics, it didn't have nearly the resources that you have today. You know, we had the one paper, and then you had to go to the library and find others. Now, every paper, every editorial written, every book is at your fingertips. But that also means that you can choose a la carte, you know, what you're exposed to. And for people my age, I say, change the channel. Change the channel, whatever you're watching. Change it and realize that not everybody agrees with that perspective, and expose yourself to other perspectives. To kids like those today, it's get out of your news feed. Realize that, you know, the way that algorithms work and everything else, you're being fed what you already like, and understand that, and expose yourself. But boy, with that knowledge, go into public service and run for office. Get involved in campaigns, you know, whether it's on the policy side, you know, at a think tank or an advocacy group, get involved. And when I see people like your students today, they are well-equipped and much further along than I was at that age, certainly.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and Senator, it's a privilege to have you here, and thank you for your incredible service to the nation, and we look forward to you continuing to make a great contribution to our nation. Zoe, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
John, I'm always privileged to share the stage in your furniture, and so it's just always great to be with you.
Now I gotta put it back in the car.
Thank you all for coming. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you.